Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caroline Wilkie and I'm the CEO of the ARA. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. For me, based here in Canberra, it's the Ngunnawal Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm coming to you from lockdown in Canberra, week 6. So I would like to do a special shout out to everyone watching today from lockdown on the East Coast. Today's webinar is to mark the official launch of the ARA's Rail Freight Action Plan. Over the past 18 months, the ARA has focused on a series of research projects which has sought to build a robust evidence base for our work. The results are critical to achieve our mission as a research-led, evidence-based advocate for industry, with the credibility of analysis from respected experts and global institutions behind us. Most significantly in the freight space, these recent projects have included the 2020 Value of Rail report, which was a detailed and bespoke modelling of rail industry value financially, socially, environmentally, and beyond, which was conducted by Deloitte. We've also had another major piece of work prepared by GHD on the impediments to rail mode shift, which was modelling and analysis to catalogue key impediments to achieving rail mode shift in the Australian market. But we will hear more about that during today's event. This research has provided a foundation for us to translate existing strategy work, informed by contemporary industry consultation, into a specific and measurable work plan for the coming 12 months and beyond. This work has resulted in the ARA's Rail Freight Action Plan. This action plan reflects the ARA's focus on rail freight and is the first of a multi-year strategy to raise the profile of the rail freight sector and relevant policy issues. I will introduce our panellists as the discussion progresses, but first I'm going to hand over to the ARA's General Manager Rail Freight, Georgia Nichols, to give a brief presentation on the industry consultation which has underpinned development of the plan and the activities in the plan itself. Welcome, Georgia.
Thanks, Caroline. For those who don't know you, I'm Georgia Nichols, General Manager of Rail Freight at the ARA. I was really pleased to join the ARA in January this year and have been since working pretty solidly on consultation on really building our advocacy platform in the rail freight space, and very pleased to be here today to be able to launch our action plan for industry. First of all, the objectives of the plan itself. The ARA's Rail Freight Executive Committee launched a strategic plan in 2020, which sort of outlines our strategic objectives for rail freight and the key focus areas for research and advocacy, which underpin our effort. Our overarching objectives are to improve the regulatory environment, promote investment in rail as an essential service, and increase rail freight's mode share. But since coming into the role, it's been clear that in order to drive our advocacy research and promotional efforts further, we needed to draw on the expertise of industry to decide where we're going to be placing our emphasis. We know that the business case for investment in the growth and development of rail freight is strong. There's patent advantages over our competitors in relation to resource efficiency and environmental impact, safety, reduction of congestion, pressure on road networks, and contribution to regional communities. The ARA's 2020 Value of Rail report that Caroline just mentioned affirmed and quantified the economic, environmental, social and regional contributions of rail freight in Australia. But I'm preaching to the converted. The ARA's 2020 Value of Rail report identified that for every 1% of the nation's freight task that moves onto rail, there's benefits to society of around $72 million a year. And that's detailed in that report. However, we all know that there remain persistent challenges constraining the efficiency and competitiveness of freight rail in Australia. So whilst there's no shortage of research and intelligence on the nature of these challenges, it's important that as an industry we come together to try and identify priorities for action, to focus our efforts on concrete goals. And this is what the action plan seeks to achieve. So how did we go about identifying priorities? We decided that our action plan needed to be built off insights from industry, and if it was going to be a rallying point for industry, as we hope it will be, and focus coordinated effort across the sector, then it needed to respond to industry's own priorities. So in trying to move beyond high-level strategy documents to a targeted plan for advocacy, we engaged Lachlan Benson and John Crosby of Blue Arcadia. Lachlan's on the call and will be part of the panel later, who worked with us to design an engagement model and workshop approach to get input from industry, both within ARA membership and well beyond. This slide shows you the approach we took, but to summarise, we knew that there are differing sets of interest within the rail freight sector, clearly differences depending on the type of goods moved, bulk, heavy haul, private operators versus containerised general freight, and depending on the areas of operation as well. So we broke down subsectors of the industry and had dedicated workshops to discuss those issues. This gives you a sense of the people involved in the sort of 3 industry-facing workshops. These followed an initial session with ARA members, but hopefully you'll see that it was a pretty strong cross-section of above and below rail operators, as well as intermodal terminal operators and other key stakeholders. So now to give you a sense of what we heard from industry. Hopefully these results won't be a surprise to any of you. I'm sure they won't, but I'm going to run through them because hopefully you'll see the fact that we've built our actions in response to what we heard directly from industry. So the first of these workshops was with ARA members, as I said. There's some very clear priorities coming out in the primary issues that were identified. Productivity was far and away the sort of number one up in lights and an important focus for how we direct our efforts. In addition to regulatory issues, which continue to plague industry in a number of ways, and the importance of promoting the industry's ESG credentials, beyond just sustainability benefits, but also those benefits that flow to regional communities, employment opportunities outside of major cities, the benefits in terms of congestion, amenity, well beyond just the pure greenhouse gas and sustainability benefits. When we're looking at the secondary issues, this is where we invited people to talk about issues that, okay, those 3 might be number one, but what have we missed in the discussion? And there was some quite interesting issues. I would say the whole workshop program threw out about 130 topics, so there was no shortage of issues for us to cover, but trying to summarise them here in a meaningful way. Land use planning, a very obvious challenge and one that continues to get more difficult as our cities continue to get denser over time. Connectivity of inland rail, obviously both at the start and end, if you like, of the track, but indeed also in regional locations, making sure that we fully leverage the benefits of inland rail investment for regional rail networks along the alignment. Inconsistency of standards. I think this goes beyond just standards in a strict interpretation of the word, but that real theme around interoperability and the challenges for all rail stakeholders, whether it's below or above rail, customers, freight forwarders or others in the supply chain that really are limited in their productivity and efficiency because of interoperability challenges. Infrastructure investment, we know that there's been a pretty significant underinvestment in freight rail networks over time in Australia, and whilst we're extremely grateful for the huge investment that inland rail represents, there's still good work to be done in making sure that freight rail is adequately supported in the ongoing maintenance and investment across the country. And above rail investment obviously is kind of more of an industry-facing issue, but it's one around trying to make sure that the right drivers of investment are there to keep industry ticking forward. Our next workshop was specifically focused on commodities and resources stakeholders, so those that are particularly involved in the movement of primary resources and agricultural goods. And I think there were some very different issues here, and some of the main themes were the same. So primary issues, most prominently network access and regulation, port access and capacity. I think that's probably one to be expected given the nature of those businesses. Network infrastructure, and I think the one that was really quite glaring and perhaps a little different to the other groups was really workforce, skilled workforce supply and ability to access the skilled workers that are required in the rail space and allied services. Second tier issues, again, a lot of them focused on workforce, skills development, entry of new workers. So both in terms of diversity and making sure that there was a good mix of hard and soft skills and across different diversity dimensions in the workforce. Attracting young people into rail as a career and how we do that better. Encouraging people to understand the offering of rail in schools and other settings where they may be making career decisions. National recognition of qualifications. Again, really around facilitation of movement of mobility of skills across the industry and making sure that there aren't major barriers to the development of skilled workers throughout the supply chain. And then, a number of other issues that are related, I think, probably to the nature of the workforce makeup in some of these businesses. So mental health, a recognition of this as an emerging theme for industry to be considerate of. And definitely seeing a lot more activity in that space, particularly related to COVID impacts, which is also called out as a major focus area, and opportunities around sort of blockchain and other real-time tracking and accountability and transparency opportunities, which probably positions these businesses as being leaders in the technology and innovation space. Moving on to our next workshop was focused on interstate operators, so mostly in the general or containerised freight space, but with particular focus in their businesses and interstate movements. Primary issues, again, quite consistent with what we'd heard from the previous two, with interoperability number one on the list. And again, I think for businesses that are constantly traversing multiple jurisdictions, that's an obvious one. Mode competition and road pricing. Obviously, the competitive landscape is one which constantly comes up in industry conversations and is very much worthy of further interrogation. But it's about how do we advance the interests of rail freight within that competitive context. Regulatory issues and consistency of infrastructure. Again, I think an allied point to the interoperability, but perhaps a more specific subset of that. And inland rail route alignment and port connectivity, again, major determinants of the interstate network capacity over time. Secondary issues, I think, again, fairly consistent with what we've already heard, but, value of rail, very much looking at how industry can better promote itself and, how industry can be a leader for itself in developing markets and trying to drive a national rail freight strategy. And finally, our final workshop was focused on intermodal and metropolitan operators. So, port shuttles, intermodal terminal operators, and those businesses with contracts for movements in metropolitan areas primarily. Again, the regulatory environment, connectivity, access, and interoperability was sort of very, very prominent in the discussions. And I think, we're now seeing those themes emerging, and hopefully you'll see how we've responded to those in the actions that we've committed to. Again, the urban planning issue came up in regards to corridor protection, as well as issues around advocacy and promotion of industry, and how we protect and maintain the social license that rail freight enjoys. And then finally, in the second tier issues, again, we want to try and find ways to promote the green credentials of rail freight and the social and economic government environments beyond that beyond that. And how we can better encourage government and private sector co-investment in the future. In the final workshop, we also talked a little bit about how we see the division of responsibility for the advancement of rail freight industry between government and industry. And it was clear that participants really expect governments to show leadership, establish a vision, and try to coordinate across agencies to implement supporting policies and strategies to advance rail freight. And they see that as being something that's missing at the moment. Equally, there was a sense from participants that industry need to be able to provide a coordinated and well-organised set of positions for government and to actively provide government with solutions and innovative proposals to resolve issues that achieve mode shift and resolutions to interoperability and regulatory concerns. So to summarise, we ended up with what we considered to be approximately 6 key themes. Achieving competitive neutrality overarches a number of the themes that I mentioned in the workshop outcomes, but I think it's clear that whilst we probably would be foolish to try to set out to put the shackles on our competitors, we definitely need to find ways that government can better support rail freight to be genuinely cost competitive in the way that we are able to operate. Secondly, ESG and sustainability. Obviously, rail freight has some hugely beneficial externalities for society, and while they might not be the key decision drivers for our customers, they should be key principles for investment by governments and development of strategies and policies that actually achieve the kind of mode share targets that we see across jurisdictions in Australia. Thirdly, regulation and interoperability. It was very clear that there's a huge productivity loss for industry due to the continued persistent challenges that exist in navigating multiple networks, multiple jurisdictions, the both hard infrastructure constraints and the soft, standards and operating procedures and driver requirements and regulations, etc., that exist across those jurisdictions. It's something that no doubt there's been a huge amount of consideration about over time, and we continue to see NRAP try to tackle it in some respects, but there's an enormous amount of work to do there if we want to see a highly efficient national railway network. Informed investments. This is really around industry being able to positively and proactively influence decision making across jurisdictions to make sure that the right money is going to the right places to facilitate the success of rail freight in the future. Connectivity, probably an obvious one, and I won't labour that point. And workforce. We know that having a skilled workforce is critical to being able to achieve competitiveness in the market. So, what have we got in the plan? The plan is organised into 4 pillars. The first one is around policy development and advocacy. And whilst that might not sound like the most exciting set of actions, I think it reflects the fact that we realise that there's a significant amount of work to do in really detailed policy development to come up with some of those innovative solutions and strategies that we can put to government that can underpin our advocacy program. Our collective influence can only be best exerted with clear and concise positions on industry fundamentals, which have truly industry-wide buy-in. And that's why our first priority as part of the plan is setting up 3 policy working groups about key issues. First is around mode shift, second is around competitive neutrality, and thirdly interoperability and regulation. They clearly respond to the most urgent issues that were expressed by industry, and will be an opportunity for us to dig into the issues, both in terms of looking at literature and intelligence that's already available to us, supplementing that with the consultation that's required to come up with some solutions that can be the focus of our advocacy to government going forward. We know that next year is going to entail probably a federal election and many state budgets, and this work will set us up well to influence those. Before we move on, I'd just encourage you that anyone that's listening to this presentation, you don't have to be an ARA member in order to take part in these processes. We want to encourage these working groups to come up with solutions which can provide a rallying point for industry. And so please get in touch if you're interested in taking part in any of these conversations. A couple of other critical things under this pillar is the development of a rail freight infrastructure priorities pipeline. The idea is that we establish a sort of freight sector specific rolling public index of infrastructure investment priorities that we can be clear and aligned about as an industry across jurisdictions and at the national level. We know that Infrastructure Australia do a great job at a very high value level, but we're talking about infrastructure investments which might be very minor enhancements to existing networks, right up to significant major public investments. But we want to make sure that we have a clear and concise articulation of what needs to be done at an industry level that we can all be coordinated with. There'll also be some other sort of policy mapping exercises, but they will really be identifying ways to advance our advocacy program and support the findings and outcomes of these working groups. The next pillar of the action plan is research. As Caroline said, we are determined that our work will respond to evidence that we have about the Australian market. And so we're very proud and happy to have be on the precipice of commencing a piece of work through ACRI in partnership with Forge around rail freight productivity. We are very much looking forward to the leadership and guidance of John Anderson on this work, and critically will be about really trying to aggregate at a truly national level across all stakeholders the evidence and data that we need to make informed decisions about what the next generation of rail freight should look like, and what government's responsibility and role for that development is. So I'd like to think that we will be able to talk to you fairly soon about that piece of work getting off the ground, and very much look forward to the results of that. We've also committed to a significant piece of work as part of our sustainability strategy that was released last week, that will have a specific freight focus as one component, which is really around developing a rail sustainability playbook to try and confirm and quantify the rail industry's contribution to sustainable development, provide guidance for rail organisations seeking to further embed sustainability practices in their operations. There will be funding provided to this project to result in a freight specific output, and looking forward to that being something that's a very tangible response to the desire for us to be much more strident in our promotion of the rail freight industry's ESG credentials. And finally, looking forward to welcoming Lachlan to speak about a piece of work that we have well underway at the moment. We heard very consistently from stakeholders throughout the workshops and in other forums that a key point of difference between the rail freight industry and the road freight industry is the National Heavy Vehicle Regulatory Model, and specifically the productivity mandate of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. So we understand this model is considered a significant contributor to the competitive inequality between the modes, and so it really warranted further interrogation. So we've already well underway an extensive consultation program with regulators, national stakeholders, governments, and industry players to dig into that model a bit more and see what we can learn for the purposes of rail freight. PR and communications, it's critical obviously that we make sure that the work that we're doing is well promoted, and that we try to increase the profile for rail freight, both in the minds of stakeholders themselves, but particularly with government decision makers. Hopefully COVID has raised the profile of national supply chains of late. We want to try and leverage off that with some much more coordinated and consistent approaches to communications. And finally, events. We're looking forward to trying to get back into Parliament, ideally hosting a parliamentary event as soon as COVID will permit, a dedicated freight conference in next year, and a series of events, boardroom themed, with MPs or other key sort of senior stakeholders talking for the benefit of members in close-room events. So the last thing I'll say before I hand back to Caroline is just to mention that the Rail Freight Action Plan discusses a lot of the freight-specific initiatives going on in the ARA, but it would be remiss of me not to mention that there's a significant stream of work in the workforce space, which is going to respond to a number of the concerns around national qualifications, promotion in schools, and development of career change opportunities for people looking to rail. And finally, obviously, there's a huge push around sustainability and an interest in trying to push those credentials publicly. So significant investment in that space as well. So I will hand back to Caroline to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Georgia. Moving forward now, I'm pleased to invite our participants. Georgia, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Excellent, good, because my computer's saying you can't. Excellent. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome our panelists. We're very lucky to have a number of industry leaders with us today. I'm pleased to welcome Karen Anderson, who's Executive General Manager of the Port of Melbourne and a member of the ARA Board and Chair of the Rail Freight Executive Committee. Murray Cook, who is CEO of ARC Infrastructure in WA and also a member of the ARA Board. John MacArthur, Chief Commercial Officer for One Rail Australia, also an ARA board member. Tristan Anderson, Market Leader Transport with GHD Advisory based in Brisbane and a member of the Rail Freight Executive Committee. And Lachlan Benson, Managing Director of Blue Arcadia, currently leading a project investigating the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator and joining us from a nightclub somewhere. I don't know quite where, but looks like more fun than what we're doing right now. So I just wanted to start with something, the obvious question is, we've covered a lot of issues in the plan. A lot of issues were raised in a number of the workshops. I'm interested to hear from all of you as to, what's the item that's keeping you up at night? I'm going to start with Karen.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. I think for me, it's about clarity and alignment across industry. I think there is so much going on out there at the moment. We've got so many, the big build program, we've got lots of infrastructure projects underway, we've got lots of competing interests. And I think the challenge for government and probably the biggest frustration for industry is that everybody has a different wish list. So I think it is about getting clarity from industry, particularly around, where are the opportunities for alignment and what are the priority things that are actually going to make a big difference for industry, and giving that clarity to government so government can then play a role in supporting industry to shift more freight onto rail.
Absolutely. Murray?
Thanks, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to be here. For us, I think we're really supportive of the ARA's programs and the research that's been done, and so articulating a clear story to government, as the ARA has started to do, representing industry, is really important. I think the rail industry has performed fantastically through the last couple of years, through the lockdowns, through COVID, providing huge resilience in the movement of freight across borders. And that it's really stood out, I think, as something that's been fantastic to see. And for our network, we've seen a 10% increase in the movement of freight from east to west, which is really outstanding during this really tough period. One long-term dynamic that I think is interesting and something to be aware of is we're currently, obviously rail has a sustainability and a greenhouse gas advantage over road. And I think the future is that we need to stay in front of that. And I note recent announcements and initiatives in the above rail space by Wabtec, and there will be others coming. Hopefully we'll keep rail in front of road in that advantage, which is a really positive story at the moment. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Murray. John, any different issues for you? I mean, obviously, One Rail has operations on the East Coast as well.
Look, I can only agree with the comments made by Karen and Murray that industry-wide issues, and I think the ARA with this plan and some of these subgroups is actually really looking to address that and get some clarity and alignment with the industry on actually directing our efforts in around the key issues and getting government frameworks and policies in place. As an operator myself, I think one of the issues as well that we'll talk about that later in the webinar, but really this clarity around this multiple levels of regulation and the impact that has on freight rail operators and our ability to make clear and concise investment decisions around some really multiple levels of regulation, policy, and that issue of interoperability. So, these are long-term, high capital investments. So we have to make clear decisions for our shareholders around why we're doing it, what the business means to us. So clarifying and really making far more transparent decisions around the interoperability issues and the multiple levels of regulation we require to run our businesses within, I think will add huge value to the freight rail industry, and then some of the other items we've discussed earlier will actually align. So modal shift, Murray said on the ESG type items. But as I said, I think the issue associated with regulation and interoperability are critical.
Absolutely. Now, Tristan and Lachlan, and you're both uniquely positioned because you work across multiple projects in multiple areas in freight as well as other modes. Lachlan, what are you seeing as the big issues?
I'll probably just build on John's point. Thanks, Caroline. Just to say the thing that's sort of keeping me up at the moment, I think, is the lost opportunities. I think, freight in general, but rail specifically does some fantastic things. But I think there's just so many things that we could be doing and could be doing much better. I think that's what really sort of frustrates me, I guess. And when I think to John's point, we need to fundamentally address the regulatory settings for rail and for freight in the broader context, and actually make sure that the productivity settings for industry are equally, attractive to both government and industry alike. So to me, I think the story of rail in Australia, I think everyone knows, has been a fairly challenging one since day one, in terms of getting our act together, so to speak. But I think critically for rail now, I think we need to get that happening now, because I think when you look at comparisons, and we're going to talk about this later with the NHPL process, but clearly road has got it, it's got its stuff together in the way they're doing that, and they're making huge leaps and bounds. And if we don't address that, the path forward is not a pretty one. And so I think we need to get this right now, because it's going to play out in the next 10 or 20 years.
Tristan, sorry, last.
Yeah, I think of something good. Thanks, Caroline. I'm sorry to say, if I'm lying awake at night, I'm not thinking of rail sometimes, but I can imagine that that it could be that others could be. A concern that I do have, and it's similar to the others, really, it's that we do struggle to consider the full system and take a wider view of the supply chain, particularly from an international competitive point of view. So how can Australia use its supply chain to be as competitive internationally as possible, and working together to be competitive at that international level, not cannibalizing each other and what we have, and taking that optimal multimodal sort of system view. I think that one of the really interesting, exciting developments is the decarbonisation focus, and I think that is something that will help align a lot of us to look towards what an optimal sort of supply chain does look like. So I think that's really exciting, and the report picks up on that very well.
Certainly. I mean, certainly you've all picked up on some pretty fundamental issues and ones that are very important and pulled up in the plan. I might just go to some specific questions, and just a reminder to anyone who's watching the webinar, you can ask questions. There is a panel to the side. There was a screen with what to do previously, but if you can send those questions through, I can see them and ask our panel. Karen, you being the chair of the Rail Freight Executive Committee, what aspect of the work are you most looking forward to seeing coming to fruition over the life of the plan?
Thanks, Caroline. So I think Georgia highlighted really well how the plan and how the development of the plan has actually considered all of those different interests in rail. And I think certainly from my perspective, this is the first time that we've got a consolidated and aligned view across different freight rail interests to actually get a clear pathway of what needs to happen. So I think that is particularly exciting, that we've now got a very clear agenda and a clear focus across all of industry around what are the priorities to actually start making a difference. The other element I think that's particularly important is the focus on and the commitment by industry and the ARA for research, and research to underpin clear position papers and policy positions that are going to support decision making. So actually having robust data and inputs not only helps policy decision making, it also supports the position that industry is presenting. So it's not just an industry wish list, it's a justified and demonstrated position. We all know how important data and research is. So I think this is a really important platform going forward, and one I'm particularly excited to see the results of. And then probably just the last element to it is to see so many people from across the rail industry participate in the development of the action plan. I think one of the challenges we've had in rail freight is actually getting people to the table, because they're usually too busy doing their jobs. but we've actually got everybody around the table. So a big congratulations to ARA for the efforts that were made there.
Yes, certainly. We really appreciated everybody's time participating in the forums. Murray, at the risk of setting up any battle between the East and the West, obviously you operate 5,500 kilometres of rail network across southwest Western Australia, primarily for rail freight. What lessons can we learn from the WA experience that you think we can bring to bear in our policy development and advocacy on a national scale?
Thanks, Caroline. I think firstly I'll say that we actually learn a lot of lessons from looking at all the operators and owners of infrastructure assets across from the east. We have obviously a smaller population in WA, and so we actually get to see almost our future from the bigger cities and the challenges that they face, really from ports and into freight through metropolitan areas and into regional areas. So we actually constantly have been looking at the eastern states for guidance as to what we're going to face in the future. For me, there are a number of key things that in WA that we've seen, and some of those are more recent. The first is the state government support, and the Minister for Transport over here, Minister Sapiotti, is a huge supporter of rail, and that has meant that over the last few years you've seen on the passenger side, the Metronet projects are really going ahead strongly and creating a lot of focus on rail. The Bellevue car facility as well, where she's brought manufacturing back into WA, is a really huge support for rail. But from a rail freight point of view, there's been a number of things that she's done and worked with industry closely on, and we've engaged, definitely with the government on. And some of those projects include the continuation of the subsidy for containers on rail out of Fremantle Port, which is really positive, really supported by Cube and Watco through their IMG operation. And that subsidy has meant that rail share has moved over the last few years up from sort of low sort of teens, 10, 11, 12% up to 20%, which has shown and proven the value of rail in that mode of transport. She's also supporting infrastructure investment in separating passenger and rail freight bridges in the Fremantle Port. So that's to come, but that's in the future plan. And then through the Westport project, we have an opportunity really to invent a new, I suppose, supply chain out of ports as well. So that's again future work, but she's really supportive there, and that couples up with an intermodal strategy that we're working with the government on as well to find places for those containers to move more efficiently. So across the board, the government is really supportive, and that has also led to investment in regional rail through the agricultural strategy. So the state government announced $22 million, and the feds have also coupled it up so there's $200 million of regional rail and some road investment as part of that. So the government being supportive is really, really important in WA, and I think it's put us in a really good position to look at rail share. From a private sector point of view, we're seeing that there is an opportunity with some historically heavy road users, transport operators like Cube, looking to actually do the modal share that Tristan sort of talked about before, where road and rail play a role. So there's a bigger focus on what is rail's part of those supply chains. And so we're seeing lower volume tasks start to come to rail. And one example in our area is potash off the back of our Hampton Intermodal Terminal in south of Kalgoorlie as well, and hopefully a future one in Leonora. We're going to see more smaller tasks that used to go just straight on road start to move to rail as well. So they're all positive stories sort of from our side. The final one is really that the east-west line and the east-west corridor for us, rail has the dominant market share on the movement of containerised freight east to west. The issue for us in the future is that as our line becomes closer to capacity with other users, and in that 10% increase in freight that I mentioned before, it's about productivity, and that government plays a role in investing for the competitiveness and the economic benefit to Australia. And so it's not that we can't invest, it's that the end customers pay more, and that government has a role in just providing that economic incentive and that economic competitiveness supply chain. So I think for us, it's focusing down on the key investments where government can partner with industry to improve, again, the international competitiveness of our country.
Certainly a lot of really positive initiatives in WA, and just highlights the joys of federation and some of the challenges that we face moving forward, which is a good segue to you, John. You've been one of the great advocates during the development of this plan since I've started, and we're very generous with your time to volunteer to actually manage one of the 3 working groups. Can you tell us a bit about how you plan to approach that work and what do you hope to achieve? So you're looking after interoperability and regulation. So 2 of the really hot topics.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I mean, as an introduction, we saw from the items that Georgia raised that the issues around interoperability and regulation and some of those, the framework agreements across multiple jurisdictions is obviously something that's very front of mind for freight operators. You know, to hit on your earlier comment, at the end of the day, the Australian rail sector's just a great remnant of colonial governments. Most rail lines point to their own ports, etc. There's different gauges, there's different axle loads, etc. So it is a critical issue for making good decisions about investment and growth in the rail freight industry. So the key purpose of the Interoperability and Regulation Working Group is to develop a detailed policy paper and actually define the key interoperability and regulatory concerns that are impacting rail freight operations in Australia, which we all know inevitably add cost or reduce operational efficiency and therefore the competitiveness of rail overall. So especially on some of those short haul, smaller tasks that Murray hit on. The outcome of our work is really should form the basis of an industry and via the ARA, really contribution to the National Rail Action Plan and their working group on interoperability. So as many rail industry participants are aware, one of the key areas of focus of the NRAP is to improve the efficiency and safety of rail system by continuing to align or harmonise the operating rules and the infrastructure and operational standards and systems across the rail networks. I think it was 2016, the BITRE report identified, and I'll quote, harmonisation may deliver benefits such as a lower input cost, improvements in operational efficiency, higher inherent safety and lower employee training costs, and even opined at the time about the ability of harmonisation to widen freight rail's market share. That was 2006 and some pretty positive comments. So I think this is our opportunity now to align all that and get some key people focused on it so we can start developing those policy and advocacy frameworks. So given that, our working group focus is to really forensically review these issues of interoperability between the networks and systems, as well as the complex regulatory systems and issues faced by rail freight operators. We want to propose solutions to these challenges, which could either be industry-led or the subject of advocacy for government implementation. We're going to make some recommendations about resources to achieve the policy goals as part of the Rail Freight Action Plan. We're looking to engage far more broadly with non-ARA members to work on specific initiatives as needed, and we'll very much collaborate to develop a detailed policy position paper, which seeks to receive that industry-wide endorsement. It's important the whole industry comes together and aligns this rather than get a fractured message to governments, both state, local and federal. The group has been formed. It's in its initial guise, but we will look to bring in relevant subject matter experts and technical assistance as and when required, and we get into some of the more detailed and technically complex issues of interoperability. And hopefully we'll get some very clear insights into the day-to-day issues faced by freight rail operators, but more importantly, probably develop some very clear plans and policy frameworks to improve and really provide a pathway for efficient and effective freight rail operations in Australia.
I have to say, of the 3 working groups, is one I feel most passionate about because I've heard shocking stories since I've started in this role about things where you just go, this just defies logic. And I think, I've been incredibly disappointed with the challenges we've had, particularly in recent months, with the changes and impact of COVID. I think last year we were doing much better from a state government perspective, and this year, everything has changed and inconsistencies, and it's just shown that the desperate need to refocus on this area. Tristan, a lot of the work that we've been doing has been informed by a great piece of work that you've done about rail freight mode shift. Just wondering if you could talk about the key findings from that research and what do you think our priorities should be to really promote that mode shift moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So the impediments and opportunities report really sort of challenges the view that there are hard constraints or impediments to rail mode shift. You know, i.e. that the rail only works, you know, for example, in the movement of heavy bulk goods over longer distances. So the report looks at potential impediments with a realistic qualitative lens, showing what is needed to achieve viability and competitiveness. So, for example, we did look at distance travelled as an impediment to rail mode shift, i.e. shorter haul rail. Based on our analysis and based on input from all the members, we distilled, you know, why it isn't an impediment, and what other factors, if optimized, including cycle times and efficient port interfaces, can really make shorter haul rail viable and work. So it addresses different preconceptions about rail and looks at what other factors, if optimized and changed, can sort of relieve those impediments. You know, findings sort of also included the need for industry to be able to cluster around intermodal terminals in particular, so to minimise that last mile cost. This requires a proactive land use, a planning approach. So obviously a role for government here as well to make sure that industry clustering is possible. Also another sort of challenge with rail is what we sort of call the commitment asymmetry. Whereby rail users and rail clients may only commit volume and enter contracts for a number of years, but the rail operator and investor has to commit for many, many years due to the sort of timelines of the payback for infrastructure. So that is a challenge, and that's a challenge for rail. It's not insurmountable, but it needs to be recognised as a challenge. In terms of the Rail Freight Action Plan, I think one of the best things is actually it's the diversity of thought that has gone into it. Historically, the working group that I've been part of for a while is made up of long-term rail industry people who are great. But to be honest, we all sort of think in a similar way. This time we had the guidance of the chair group, Karen Anderson, who can take a full system view and ask sort of interesting and tough questions. And also Georgia, I spoke before, ARA General Manager Rail Freight, who's done a fabulous job, but from another sector and coming in with that sort of sort of constrained view, and really brought a fresh pair of eyes, and yourself as well, Caroline. So I think that's been a real difference. We need that diversity of thought in the sector more than any. We're going through change, and in order to navigate that significant change, we need, and as I mentioned before, sort of front and centre, one of those key changes is decarbonisation and need for us to be ahead of that trend, ESG and sustainability. So we've got a great opportunity, and this strategy is a really strong platform and encourage beginning of a conversation and encourage people to be part of that conversation as much as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tristan. It's a great piece of work, and we will share that with the industry. Lachlan, you're also doing a piece of work for us on the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. This was an interesting one, almost from when I started, was the why is the roads lobby ahead of the rail lobby? It's an interesting debate. I mean, I'm fairly simplistic with it. I think, you know, if you're a member of parliament and you're likely to have a number of large trucking organisations in your electorate and a number of truckers who'll go and talk to you at events, you know, it is going to be more front and centre than anything else. You know, I don't think that there is, you know, an association that's actively going, oh, please give us all these extra billions. I think it is that groundswell, but it's an interesting one then when you look at the productivity and regulatory environment that road industry sits in. So I know it's too early to give us the results of the paper, but I mean, what are your initial thoughts of the research you've done so far?
Thanks, Caroline. And I think, you know, just sort of dialing it back a little bit to the workshops we ran earlier in the year with the rail freight and board's members and other sort of the broader rail industry as well. I mean, I think touching on that point John did, that, you know, productivity was front and centre, and sitting behind that was what's the regulatory environment, and then it was all these issues about longer trains, interoperability. There were so many things linked to this regulatory piece, and everyone, you know, to your point, Caroline, was holding up the NHBR as this kind of beacon on the hill, as to say, hey, these guys have got this, like, why can't we have that? And there was perception. So we have, you know, we're in the midst of this process at the moment where we've sort of engaged with the regulators. So we actually have engaged with NHBR itself to talk about productivity and how that works in their day-to-day environment and their objectives and how they go about doing that. We've talked to the National Transport Commission as well, who obviously were responsible for the establishment of the single regulators and their perceptions of how NHBR works, because there are differences across those regulators, as we know. And we've spoke with ONSA itself as well, obviously from the safety regulator, but interestingly, whereas NHBR hasn't actually got into all the states, ONSA has. So there is some advantages in rail. We've also gone to talk to the sort of major industry associations as well, trying to get their perspective, and that includes the ATA as well. We've spoken representative of the ATA about that to get their views on how they interface with the NHBR and the pros and cons of that model from them as users, if you like. And we've also sort of spoken to the ALC from a customer perspective and talked to people who are actually putting freight on rail and what they see as the regulatory impediments to rail. I mean, and that was quite interesting because on a positive perspective, what they actually said, one of the big users of freight said, if we could get more trains, we'd put more freight on rail. So this is what I sort of talked a little bit about. To me, it's the frustration of those missed opportunities. In fact, if we could sort these things out, we know we'd actually be successful. So at the moment, we're sort of going through the point at the moment, we're talking to a number of the operators around that. So we've met with PN, we're meeting with John next week, and other Horizon as well. So we're going through this process, following discussions with the operators. We're going to be talking to the state jurisdictions as well, because any outcome is going to, at a national level, be contingent on the state jurisdictions as well. But it's too early to say in the research where we're actually at, kind of the outcome. But clearly, the NHBR is sort of held up as an equivalent model for rail. You've got the work that's going on around the National Rail Action Plan as well, which is kind of one avenue as well to try and address things. And you've also got, as I talked to you before, you've got a safety regulator who, is in the national space already and has those relationships, and what role can they play in that productivity debate? Because I think probably one of the key learnings I've taken to date out of NHBR was that they've said that safety and productivity are not mutually exclusive, and that's how they work their angle as a regulator, but also their focus on their mandate on productivity.
I think it's an exciting opportunity for us to view, if for no other reason than to put to bed, to have a definitive answer and view about where to for industry. I think would be very worthwhile. Karen, obviously this plan will only be as successful as the amount of engagement we get from industry. As the chair of the Freight Executive Committee, do you want to just maybe share how people can get involved?
Sure. So I think, as Georgia outlined in the action plan itself, there's a number of initiatives that are being proposed. So we've got 3 working groups, and I think Tristan said it well when he talked about, getting different people at the table and getting different perspectives. So I would strongly encourage participation. If somebody has an interest or somebody wants to know more about those activities, there are wonderful opportunities to get involved in the conversation and debate, and certainly encourage a whole host of diversity and participation in those forums, because the more views we can get around the table, the more consolidation we can get, and alignment in terms of what really is going to make a difference in those areas to drive change. The other element I would also suggest, and not to give a plug for ARA events, but certainly the action plan has a whole bunch of events that everybody can participate in. So I would strongly encourage people to get involved in those events, join the conversation and the debate, because there is so much going on out there, and particularly in the continued restrictive lockdown environments. This is a fantastic opportunity and a way for people to stay connected. We don't get those opportunities to meet people and catch up and find out what's going on in the industry. These events, platforms, working groups, this is the way to stay connected and to ensure you've got a full awareness of what's going on in the industry.
Absolutely, and I guess that's a good segue to give a plug for our Rail Freight Executive Committee. So I know there are over 100 people on this call right now, so if you're not engaged with that committee, you can reach out to Georgia. Someone has also raised, we have some questions here that I won't have time to get to, but someone had also raised two sub-issues. One was around type approval processes, and that comes back to supply chain issues that are impacting on the rail freight sector. We are actually launching our supply chain strategy next Wednesday, which has a number of these elements in it, and we have just launched our sustainability strategy, which is now online as well. I will pass to Georgia, though, just quickly, conscious of time. Do you want to just give a quick overview? I'm really excited about this piece of work that we're doing with ACRI and Forge. Do you want to just give a brief overview of that?
Sure. So this is a project that's been in the works for quite a while now, and I think was the brainchild of a number of conversations from industry participants, particularly operators in the Forge Group, identifying, that there really is a gap on the national landscape around a vision for rail freight going forward. There's not many doors to knock on when you want to talk about rail freight at a national level, and for an advocacy organisation and for other industry representatives, that's a constant frustration, and I think plays into that section around the role of the NHVR as well. So in order to try and achieve a national perspective on really productivity constraints for rail freight, there's been a significant economic contribution made, I think, for the first time at a national level across all parties, including the Department of Federal, which is a really quite significant, and whilst it's been frustrating that it takes a fair bit of time on those people up, now at the point where we're about to keep all streams as that project focus on issue with our working group will generally be working parallel to those pieces, but will be
Georgia, I think we've actually lost you. Sorry, sure. We might. Georgia, we've lost you, so we might just go on. Just moving on to. I don't think you can hear me either. Just moving on now to just to finalise the webinar today. Can still hear that. Hold on for 1 second. All the best laid plans, final 2 minutes, and technology goes awry. There we go. Just wanted to finish off to give everyone an opportunity just to make final comments. So I'm a bit of a nerd on this freight action plan. I'm really excited by it. There's some fantastic meeting projects. We can really make a major change here. So great opportunity. Tristan, final thoughts?
Oh, well, on the spot. I've liked everyone's comments today, and I think it's great that we've had over 100 people dial into this. I think it is really exciting, and as I said at the beginning, I do think that the opportunity that ESG and greater sort of investment interest in terms of sustainable investments and decreasing carbon is a really good opportunity, and taking a full supply chain view, if we can, looking at what the shipping industry are doing, aligning with the type of fuels they're looking at, all that sort of stuff is super exciting, and I think it's going to really help sort of galvanize us and sort of target our approach and bring us all together. So positive for a Friday.
Murray,
I think it's just the accumulation of those concepts around sustainability and technology and how we can overcome those issues and bring them together to focus government investment and government support for our initiatives, I think needs to all come together and be articulated well. And I think we can do that as an industry and with the people involved.
Lachlan, final thoughts?
Simple message is there's an awful lot happening, but the time to strike is now. And I think, we've got the right environment.
And now we've lost you, Lachlan. Sorry. John, pass to you. Final comments?
Yeah, probably just to advance on what Lachlan was saying. I agree. I think the time is right. Anyone who knows me and has dealt with me in industry in the various forums I'm involved with knows that this issue of complex regulatory and alignment and interoperability is my personal soapbox. I'm pretty excited to actually try and lead as a bit of alignment and direction on that for the industry. So I think the plan's fantastic, and I think the group we've got working with us to actually support this should drive home some real change and allow us to actually improve in the future. So I think it's an exciting time.
Wonderful. And Karen, final word to you.
I think for me, it brings together everybody's comments. The Rail Freight Action Plan provides a fantastic platform, I think, for all of us to line up our individual and collective effort to drive real change across the supply chain. So let's get on with it.
Absolutely. And big thank you and well done to Georgia and Lachlan for pulling this piece of work together. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Tristan for GHD's work in this space as well. Thank you to all of our panelists. I will end with a final plug to say that if you do have an interest in getting involved in the working groups or the freight committee or any of the work that we've talked about today, please contact Georgia. And we would love to have you involved. Obviously, we are only as strong as we are united in this work, so please do get involved. I hope you have a lovely Friday afternoon and a wonderful weekend. And for those of you in lockdown, I think we all get to have picnics this weekend. Yay us! So get out there and enjoy that, and I hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Thank you very much for your time today.